Hello, this is a continuation of my long essay on sociological theories regarding the emergence and development of new religious movements. This is the first of a number of videos on crisis theories. So we've already talked about psychological theories covering deprivation, relative deprivation, and the concept of deprivation. And now we're starting on the crisis, the idea of crisis. So there's actually a lot of details here, so we'll gradually unfold that in future videos. So let's start off with crisis theories in general. Whilst deprivation theorists have sought to relate the emergence and continuing attraction of certain religious movements to the psychological experience of deprivation, they have at best done no more than to indicate an apparent correlation between objective deprivation and the membership of certain religious movements at certain times. As to why only a small minority of the people labeled deprived join such movements, deprivation theory is uninformative. One response to this lack of explanatory power has been what may be termed crisis theory. According to this view, it is not so much deprivation as the experience of some crisis by which normal experience and expectations of the world have been upset, which accounts for movement membership. As yet, crisis theory has found no unitary expression, but rather is represented by congeries of diverse theoretical ideas, which have been developed in different disciplines to account for a varied range of movements. The most prevalent of these crisis explanations in sociology center on what have come to be termed millenarian movements, that is, social movements in which the religious conception of a perfect age to come has assumed central importance and given rise to expectations of imminent, total, ultimate, this-worldly collective salvation. Anthropologists, on the other hand, have centered their attention on those nativistic and acculturative movements which emerged primarily amongst third world peoples in response to the impact of European and Euro-American colonialism. Other theoretical expressions have included the categories of revitalization movements, that is, any deliberate, organized, conscious effort by members of a society to construct a more satisfying culture in the face of chronic stress, and crisis cults, that is, any collective response to crisis which was based on a non-pragmatic, sacred attitude to a set of beliefs. One major failing of most of these theories of crisis is that they normally subsume too great a range of phenomena under the rubric of crisis. Thus, in a wide-ranging summary of the literature, Talman rooted millenarianism in conditions of acute or multiple deprivation, disaster, the structural inability of certain groups of people to achieve their hopes and expectations, disruption, confusion, and the disintegration of traditional cultural systems, social marginality, and the disruption of traditional group ties. All contexts which were perfectly likely to occur in periods of marked socio-economic change and loss of traditional social stability. An even broader range of possible crises was presented by Labar, for whom any massive helplessness after critical juncture may be a crisis, and the recurrent and insoluble problem of death is, in a sense, a permanent crisis. This is all far too undiscerning unless one accepts Wallace's view that all psychophysiological stress is the same. Certainly, in relation to the historical evidence, there seems little reason to suppose that all crises induce similar religious consequences. Again, if the range of possible crises becomes so expanded that the putative experience of crisis becomes normal and the number of possible crises far exceeds the number of crisis-based movements, then the theory is denuded of any precise or determinative meaning. To escape these problems, some theorists have focused on the importance of multiple, overwhelmingly severe and unexpected crises. But even with these constraints, the theory remains explanatorily inadequate, in extremis sharing with deprivation theory the same ex post ante methodology by which the analyst discovers that a particular crisis was sufficiently severe or multiple or unexpected to be movement generated, primarily on the basis of the emergence of an actual movement. As against such a response, I would contend that what is needed in crisis theory is a far more rigorous and differentiated conception of what constitutes a crisis, combined with a more exact appreciation of the various societal and ideological contexts within which crises may occur and be experienced. Although less often portrayed in aggregate psychological terms than deprivation theory, most statements of crisis theory rest on the same psychological presuppositions and so continue to be based on an inadequate theory of motivation, ultimately relying on some variant of the frustration compensation hypothesis. They tend towards a psychological reductionism, which negates the possibility of positive action and purposive motivation, and thus fails to adequately account for the differential occurrence of movements within common contexts of crisis. A more satisfactory psychological basis for crisis explanations is the motivation theory advanced by Abraham Maslow. According to Maslow, the fulfillment of basic human needs provided the main motivation for human behavior. As the prepotency of such needs varied considerably, they could be arranged into a need hierarchy. It was stated that the relative fulfillment of each prepotent set of needs in turn enabled higher order needs to assume importance. Thus, at the most basic level, the human organism needed what would ensure its physiological survival, and only when its various physiological needs had been relatively well gratified would attention turn to higher order needs. These in turn were those needs concerned with the organism's safety, security, stability, protection, and so on, belongingness and love, esteem, both the feelings of self-confidence and adequacy in the face of the world, and the desires for prestige and attention, and finally self-actualization, the need for the individual to express his or her own creative life pattern. For most people, none of these basic needs were ever completely satisfied. Maslow added the caveats that this order of prepotency was valid for most people, but not for all, that each of these 5 categories of needs comprised component elements of varying importance, that certain particular desires and needs comprised elements from more than one category, sex and the desire to establish frameworks of knowledge being notable examples, and that much human behavior was overdetermined, that is, motivated by a number of basic needs. Within such a framework, deprivation may be conceived as the blocking and non-fulfillment of basic needs. Maslow himself argued that many so-called deprivations did not lead to the various presumed effects of psychological deprivation and frustration, being either unimportant for the individual or an unavoidable part of an adaptation to the process of growing up. Those deprivations which were important were those which were perceived as a threat to the personality. In the unneurotic individual, these threatening frustrations stemmed from the blocking of basic human needs. On this basis, it's possible to identify a hierarchy of threatening deprivations corresponding to Maslow's need hierarchy. These, in order, being threats to the individual's physiological, safety, love and belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization needs. As the lower levels of needs become relatively satisfied, so the levels of concern, which occasion frustration, rises. On the basis of the schema, we might expect each of these kinds of deprivation, or of non-fulfillment of needs, to evoke certain kinds of response, and to some extent to be related to particular kinds of social crisis. There is no simple correlation between levels of deprivation and type of response, however. Maslowian theory rather merely suggests an overall framework of probabilities and limitations within which conscious human action may generally operate. I should say that I have actually made a couple of videos on Maslow's need hierarchy and go into his ideas in much more detail there. I'll give the reference below the video. Gur's reworking of the need hierarchy is heuristically useful here. The variant levels of the hierarchy regrouped into three general categories concerned with the individual's basic physical, psychic, and social potency needs. In this context, physical welfare needs are those concerned with physiological survival and physical safety. Psychic needs are those concerned with psychological security, belongingness, love, self-confidence, meaningfulness, and the realization of ethical values. And social potency needs are those concerned with the adequate manipulation of one's social environment so as to preserve one's self-esteem and gain prestige. Whilst these categories necessarily overlap, they provide a useful schema for discussion of crises and their relation to the emergence of religious and other movements. So that's what I'm going to say for the moment. Many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please do like, comment, and share on the video. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give the link to my Patreon account below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about crises of survival. Have a good day.